Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a hometown scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Monte Cristo Act. Hello there. Every so often we hear a story of someone who went over Niagara Falls in a barrel, or who wanted to stand on a wing of a jet plane to see what it feels like. There are lots of brave souls in the world, or perhaps it would be more correct to put it, there are lots of foolhardy people who just don't care. Anyhow, they make news with jumps off Golden Gate bridges, ocean hops with puddle jumping airplanes, and parachute jumps from the stratosphere. Grays Harbor has seen its share of daredevils. There was the human fly who climbed the face of the Finch building one day in 1917, and the flyer named Christensen, who took an old hydroplane off from the Hoquiam River in a day when going up in a plane was about a 50-50 chance of surviving. There was Dr. Seth Maker, who jumped from the top of the Heron Street Bridge into a page of history, and probably none of the most daredevilish of them all that the harbor has recorded ever made more history or gave himself and the public more thrill than E.L. Johnson, an Aberdeen resident in the year of 1901. Not only was his act in which he recreated the famed escape from a bag underwater performed by the fictional Count of Monte Cristo, not only was it his act a thriller, but it was nearly more than that. It's a good yarn, we think, and we have given it a place in our hometown scrapbook, along with the trimmings that made the 4th of July of 1901 a memorial event for Grays Harbor. So when Dick Crombie has said a few words from our sponsor, we'll open our scrapbook to the story of E.L. Johnson and his Count of Monte Cristo act that made history. Now back in 1901, the sawdust city of Aberdeen was trying its best to look and act like a fully bloomed metropolis. It was in the days before the Aberdeen fire. The rows of wooden buildings still marked the city as boom stuff, and its sawdust streets were still an enigma to out-of-towners and newcomers. The town had few city-wide celebrations, but it managed to work out a 4th of July observance back in the 1890s that was alternated jointly with Hoquiam and Aberdeen that gave the town something to shout about once a year. And in 1901, Aberdeen was celebrating. The committee in charge of the program worked diligently to put together a complete program for the big audience of folks that was expected, with boatloads sure to arrive from Westport, Montesano, Hoquiam, and Cosmopolis, and a program with a wide variety of fabricated, including a formal arrangement that was to be staged in the Acme Opera House on Wishkah Street, sports and games for young fellows, and the day's activities were to be complete with a water show. But what was to be the climax? The committee scratched its head and asked citizens of the town to contribute ideas, but no one came up with anything, that is. Not until E.L. Johnson volunteered to do the Count of Monte Cristo act. Now, E.L. Johnson probably doesn't mean much to present-day generations, but old-timers will link his name to one of the town's most famous residents, for E.L. Johnson and Megaphone Johnson were one and the same. And only a year or two before this particular 4th of July, the young man with the booming voice had distinguished himself by jumping from the top of the Heron Street Bridge, an awesome tower, into the Wishkah River as a substitute for the champion high diver of the world who failed to make his appearance. Megaphone Johnson had an idea. He had read the thrilling story from the pen of Alexander Dumas, the Count of Monte Cristo, and he had been most impressed with the escape of the Count from a bag that had been thrown into the sea. Why not duplicate that act? He would conceal a pocket knife that would be sewn into the sack and be thrown into the river by the committee. Then he would slit the sack and come to the surface. It all seemed easy, and it would give the program some luster. Besides, Megaphone Johnson had a reputation to uphold. He talked it over with the committee, and they agreed that it sounded like a fitting climax to the show. The Count of Monte Cristo Act, they would call it, and it would come as the highlight of the day's activities. And so, the 4th of July, 1901 came to Aberdeen. The day was opened in the best traditions with a blast from an improvised cannon, and folks were soon up and around preparing for the parade. It took the whole town to make a parade, but the visitors provided the audience along the plank sidewalks. So Aberdeen spread itself to put on a show. The Knights of Pythias turned out in full regalia, and the Columbia girls were decked out in the misty costumes. The volunteer fire department, headed by Chief E.L. Collier, marched in the body, their blue uniforms pressed, towing the old Tiger, the nearest thing to a piece of firefighting equipment that the town owned. The woodsmen of the world marched, the foresters were all in line, and many of the town's business houses had floats entered into the parade. For example, Smith's Drug had an impressive scene of an outdoor America with a pair of live bears and a badger mounted on a conveyance. Pyatt and Coxey Furniture Company had an inspiring patriotic display, and Nelson and Bretsch and others entered displays. The town's leading department store that they had managed by George J. Wolfe had a float with a live eagle on it, and Michael Flynn, the town's leading fishmonger, entered a float with a quinault salmon frozen into a block of ice. Doc Paul Schmidt was the parade marshal, the active medico who had time for everything, lined up the procession, and then, mounted on a horse, with an entourage of accompanying riders, the parade marched off down Heron Street. A program at the Acme Opera House followed the parade, and Mrs. Sam Anderson rendered the Star-Spangled Banner to tremendous applause. There was speaking by the Reverend Charles Dermott, delivering the keynote address, and then the games and sports began. Palmer Agee won 60 cents for the contest amongst the lads of the town. He won the tube diving contest. Young Dick Alton was $1 richer for winning the pie eating contest, and he pocketed another $1 for second place in the biscuit eating contest. Malcolm Stewart won $1 for coming in second to Cliff Giles in the 75-yard dash for boys, and Minnie Guilford won $2 for the girls' race. John Greer won both the fat man's race and the tall man's race and was rewarded with $5 worth of photography by the local studio. The half-mile bicycle race was a thriller. It went to George Saucer, who received a gold medal, while Leon McNeil was second and received a silver medal. In the quarter-mile bicycle race, Ray Ellis won $5 for the fastest time, with Roscoe Fear coming in second to take the $2 consolation prize. Chester Young won the big money when he came in first in the pony race. His prize was $7. Emil Ephon received an award for having the best dressed window display. His cannon and carriage, all made of silverware, was adjudged first prize winner. And then the audience flocked to the banks of the Wishkah River to see the water sports. There was some swimming races, diving contests, and a log rolling exhibition, and then the committee touted out its much-talked-about feature, the Monte Cristo Act. Megaphone Johnson stepped out onto the beside the Heron Street Bridge, and the committee slipped him into the Cambridge bag and stitched the bag up with sail-making needle. The crowd in Sam Ben's orchestra on the dock at the Aberdeen House on the Heron Street Bridge and the lining the East River bank watched the proceeding with interest. It didn't seem like much of a trick, really. It was just a matter of cutting a hole in the bag, but some of the watchers pointed out that it just might not work. He just might land in such a way that he couldn't use the knife. he just might drop the knife inside the bag while he was being hurled through the air before splashing into the water, then be unable to find it, or there was any of a number of things that could happen. And probably some such jumble of ideas was going through Megaphone Johnson's head at the same time. And as they pushed him into the sack and closed it, he clutched the knife closely and hoped for the best. And while the assembled holiday crowd watched, half in awe and half in anticipation of a tragedy, the committee dropped the bag containing the would-be emulator of the Count of Monte Cristo into the muddy waters of the Wishkah River. A buzz of excitement went up, and the crowd leaned forward to catch the first sight of the stuntman coming to the surface. But he didn't come. Finally, the sack came up, but no Megaphone Johnson. Now the committee had a premonition of possible tragedy, and they had stationed swimmers along the dock ready to leap in to rescue in the event that the trick went awry. The swimmers went into action. Committee man Jim Fuller shouted to the swimmers to dive for him. But before they could make their plunge, up came Megaphone Johnson. Head down, one of the swimmers struck out from the bank to seize him. The others helped to pull him ashore. The crowd grew quiet and watched with awe, wondering if it was just as they had witnessed or if it was a tragedy. But with Megaphone Johnson spread out on the dock, spattered with blood from the long gash in his hand, it was soon apparent that while he had not emerged from the bank quite as smoothly as the fictional Count of Monte Cristo, he had managed to squeeze out with his life. And within a half an hour, the committee had brought the stuntman out of the waterlogged status, bandaged his cut hand, and he was able to tell his story. First, it seemed, he did drop the knife. Then he recalled the bag became unusually hard to cut once it had become wet. He had practiced several times on a dry bag, but not on a wet one. Yielding fabric had not permitted him much opportunity to cut, and he slashed at it randomly in an attempt to free himself. Then it appeared in the slashing that he had cut his hand, but he finally got loose from the sack, and the presence of the swimmer had saved his life. Megaphone Johnson took a bow and added one more laurel to his repertoire, the only man to be thrown into the Wishkah River in a bag and come out alive. Now, Dick Crombie, a few words from our sponsor. Yes, it was quite a celebration that they had on Grace Harbor back in 1901. There were fireworks that night, and William Meade was hit in the face with a skyrocket that nearly severed his nose and cost him the sight in one eye. The loggers roared along the skid row, and the doors of the town's numerous bars fanned the summer air. But the stunt they talked about for years afterwards was Megaphone Johnson's Monte Cristo act that nearly ended in tragedy. And, as committeeman Jim Fuller, now Aberdeen City Treasurer, recalls, would have had not been for the lifeguard that they had stationed nearby to give a happy ending to the story in our hometown scrapbook for tonight. Thanks for listening.